Fashion flows through Paris, Milan, London, and New York, and for centuries these cities have been the birthplaces for the latest styles, talent, and ideas. As ground zero for some of the world's most prestigious brands, it's in these cities where trends are born. Yet the biggest fashion companies today are not English, American, or Italian, but instead Spanish, Japanese, and Swedish, with annual sales near or exceeding luxury powerhouses like Chanel, Gucci, and Hermes. Uniqlo, H&M, and Zara emerged in the 1990s and have dominated the mass market for the past 3 decades. Fast fashion, for better or worse, has withstood the test of time. These upstarts rapidly expanded across the West in the 2010s, taking market share from giants like Gap and Ralph Lauren on their home turf, driving J.Crew to bankruptcy, and turning Abercrombie and American Eagle into afterthoughts. When the industry realized they couldn't beat fast fashion, they joined them. The game has changed. A space that historically competed on creativity and creation has now pivoted towards speed and curation. Fast fashion optimizes for speed and cost over quality. Why gamble on innovation when you can profit from proven demand? They watch what's popular and then create products to match the latest trends as quickly as possible so they can sell while demand exists. They manufacture in small quantities to minimize inventory. They sell cheap and produce even cheaper by outsourcing and using mostly synthetic materials. The playbook is simple. Get in, get out, and then reposition for the next trend. What fast fashion labels lose in quality and originality, they make up for in value and volume. The mass market has embraced their promise of endless variety and affordability. Modern clothing is no longer made to last, and consumers don't mind because they can easily replace what breaks with what's new at the same low cost. Despite the shorter lifespan per piece, people are buying more clothes than ever these days. Even the fashion houses and legacy labels, who built their empires on selling timeless, buy-for-life clothing, have transformed themselves over the years to be more like Uniqlo, H&M, and Zara. They've copied their business practices, poached their talent, and shifted their catalogs to sell more synthetic, limited-run products in the pursuit of growth. While people tend to paint Uniqlo, Zara, and H&M under the broad stroke of fast fashion, in reality they all operate very differently. On paper, anyone should be able to replicate their playbook. Factories can be easily Googled, and trends can be easily seen in minutes on social media. Above all, fashion is fickle. In this world, success is difficult to achieve and even harder to maintain. The industry is littered with the bodies of brands like Burberry, American Apparel, and Under Armour, who all once looked unstoppable but ended up as being just a flash in the pan. To get to the top is one feat, to stay on the throne is another. As everyone else has started copying what they're doing, Uniqlo, Zara, and H&M have weathered the storm to varying degrees of success. Fast fashion is a case study on evolution as much as it is about moats. In business, how you view competition is the difference between fleeting success and sustained success. In this episode, we're diving into how Uniqlo, H&M, and Zara conquered the fashion industry in 3 decades, the strategies that have brought them to where they are today, and exploring what could one day topple these modern-day empires. What does the future hold in business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Analysts will say that inflation is down in 1 month and then up the next. It's the same constant whiplash with unemployment, jobs reports, and the health of the economy. Could someone please invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP bringing accounting, finance, inventory, and HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. Modern MBA is small at the moment, but as soon as we scale, we will need and use NetSuite. Today we're stitching things manually, and it's gotten harder to assess our business health. We need to track production costs, to run payroll compliant with multiple states, and to evaluate profit and loss by team and project. As a corporation, we pay tax throughout the year, and it's a nightmare jumping from system to system just to get one clear answer. These are capabilities that only NetSuite provides, and it's a platform that we intend to take every advantage of. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/modernmba. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/modernmba. netsuite.com/modernmba. In the simplest form, every business can be broken into 3 life stages: surviving, scaling, and sustaining. Any company at any time is in one of these 3 buckets. Uniqlo started in the 80s as a chain of stores selling cheap clothes to the frugal Japanese masses. The company was more of a real estate play than a fashion play. In this era before e-commerce, they achieved product market fit by blanketing Japan's suburbs with stores. Just like the fashion giants of the West, Uniqlo competed on availability rather than product in this era before e-commerce. The clothes they carried came straight from Chinese factories with minimal input. Their competitors were not established labels, but instead local boutiques and large-scale discount chains. Anyone selling cheap clothes nearby was a threat to Uniqlo. A better funded competitor could always come in stocking the same products at similar price points. Uniqlo's founder, Tadashi Yanai, then 40 years old, realized that they needed to become a brand rather than just a set of stores with clean floors and decent service. He wanted Uniqlo to become for Japan what Gap was in the US and Marks & Spencer was in the UK. While Tadashi had the ambition to turn Uniqlo into a global brand, he was measured in execution. Japan's most valuable export is not cars or circuit boards, but instead culture. This bet would pay off in spades, not just with the conventionally nationalist Japanese, but also later with the Western markets that have romanticized Japan for generations. Between 1990 to 2004, Uniqlo was in its first era of survival, taking steps to transform itself into a by Japan, for Japan brand. Tadashi laid out a revenue goal of $1 billion in domestic sales. Achieving this sales target in his mind would signify that Uniqlo had successfully established itself as Japan's top brand and would then be ready to compete on the global stage. To do that, Uniqlo needed to start designing its own clothes rather than simply buying from factory catalogs. Yet the business plan remained the same: to sell everyday, practical clothing at the lowest market price. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of Japan's lost decade. The 1990s was a harsh time for the country with the stock market crash, deflation, and high unemployment. Uniqlo needed differentiation to grow sales at home, but also needed to find ways to keep prices low under this decade-long recession. Since most of their capital was tied into stores, there just wasn't enough money left to risk on bold designs, and there was no way that Uniqlo would ever come close to the creativity of big brands and fashion houses. Out of necessity, the company appealed to the modest, pragmatic Japanese mass market by staying far away from the loud branding that had become prominent in American fashion. It was in the late 1990s when Tadashi found the winning formula. Fleeces had become the hottest thing in America, and that trend had flowed to Japan. Yet the garment was out of reach for the average Japanese citizen. Uniqlo tapped into this domestic demand by rolling out a low-cost, differentiated synthetic fleece. To stand out from the inevitable flood of cheap fleeces, they had proactively tweaked the design, used a unique blend of fibers, and marketed that stronger insulation and improved practicality. It was Uniqlo's first major product to not just be cheap, but also quality and stylish in its own right. Sales doubled in a single year and then quadrupled the year after. Tadashi realized that Uniqlo could lift and shift this formula to fill these quote-unquote latent consumer needs. Identify trending pieces that were too expensive for the average Japanese, replace their natural fibers with synthetic for lower cost, but proactively make enough tweaks to quote-unquote exceed customer expectations through merit. Uniqlo surpassed $1 billion in sales in 2000 thanks to the success of their fleece. The company followed through its commitment by opening up the first international store in London a year later. But by 2003, fleeces had fallen out of fashion and sales plummeted, showing Tadashi that this formula would only work with speed. You can strike gold, but one product will never be enough to sustain growth. Since Uniqlo was losing millions overseas on new stores across the West, thousands of miles away from home, they now needed to move faster than ever to survive with these sunk costs, especially in the face of declining profits. Overseas sales were sluggish as no one was getting excited about a cheap clothing brand from Japan. In search of hits, Uniqlo accelerated product cycles from 2 to 6 times a year and signed a 5-year, $1 billion deal with chemical suppliers to develop new synthetic fibers. Material innovation would enable Uniqlo to compete on merit rather than cost alone. They needed to shed their reputation of being good for the price to being good in general. It was a page out of the sportswear industry. Beyond the logos, Adidas, Nike, and Under Armour differentiate their products through proprietary materials that they aggressively brand with names like Flyknit and Climacool. Inventory turnover measures how many times a company sells out of its inventory in a single year, and Uniqlo cycled through products almost 9 times in a single year in search of hits. By 2004, Uniqlo had rolled out cashmere sweaters, priced 50% cheaper than the market, heat-tech winter wear, and embedded workers at factories to oversee production with the new materials. In-house synthetics became the moat, Japanese culture remained the hook, and affordability was the closer. These measures reversed the dip and returned Uniqlo to a positive trajectory. From 2005 to 2015, Uniqlo entered its second stage of scaling. Wherever the trends went, they followed. When the market gravitated towards skinny jeans, Uniqlo responded with ultra stretch and a denim collection. When puffers and parkas became fashionable, they rolled out ultra light down. And when business casual became in fashion, they rolled out chinos to fill that demand. When athleisure became a sensation, they created airism, and when collaborations exploded across the industry, they launched collections with big-name designers like Christopher Lemaire and celebrities like Pharrell. When streetwear became the latest fad, Uniqlo poached the founder of Bape to lead design. Uniqlo made a splash in every new market, planting flagship stores in the most expensive cities. A big fancy store also carried value as a marketing asset, as these stores were built to convey quality and to demonstrate that Uniqlo belonged on the same block as any big fashion brand, all of which meant less money needed for advertising. Uniqlo's domination in Japan was what funded their expansion across the West, but it would ultimately take 8 long years before Uniqlo would turn a profit abroad. This runway was only possible with the strength of Japan. This is where prior companies like Abercrombie had failed. They had also opened up these dazzling flagship properties overseas, but when their domestic sales began to dip, they opted to double down on expansion, hoping that the new growth abroad would be enough to offset the decline at home. By the 2010s, major Western brands were ramping up their investment in Asia under the sink or swim mentality, and Tadashi took a defensive posture. In response, Uniqlo blanketed Japan with tens of net new stores year after year through the mid-2010s. Surprisingly, there were no signs of fatigue or saturation. The Japanese remained fiercely loyal, as the average Uniqlo store in Japan consistently grossed nearly twice as much as the average Uniqlo store abroad. This is all the more impressive when we consider the higher prices overseas, the continued stagnation of Japan, and the strength of the euro and dollar relative to the yen. But Tadashi was still paranoid. He had seen on his visits abroad that there still existed a market where companies like Target and Primark were able to thrive selling bottom-of-the-barrel basic clothes. Not everyone had graduated to fast fashion. To hedge, he rolled out GU, a separate ultra-low-cost brand selling clothes at half the price of Uniqlo. And while most brands struggled during the Great Recession, it was in this period when Uniqlo took off. International sales surged as Americans flocked to Uniqlo for affordable essentials, just like the Japanese had done a decade ago during their downturn. But Uniqlo progressively found itself unable to match its closest rivals in H&M and Zara when it came to speed and styles. They couldn't R&D fast enough to sell the latest runway looks and viral outfits. Rather than speeding up, they slowed down. Sales had grown in a decade from $2 billion in 2005 to $11 billion in 2015 off of selling everyday basics, and the company had built this business through refining rather than pioneering. By the mid-2010s, Uniqlo had nearly the same amount of stores abroad as they did in Japan, and the brand at this point was well established. Customers knew what to go to Uniqlo for, and they needed to be able to get the products that they were looking for. The conventional fast fashion tactic of stocking less and selling every possible trend was no longer useful at this scale. Inventory turnover dropped from 9 in the early 2000s to just 3 by 2015 as the company pivoted to prioritize availability and optimization. The flagship stores were expensive and the company was opening hundreds every year. Despite the rapid growth in sales, Uniqlo's profits had steadily declined to as low as they were in the 1990s. In business, what you measure is what you get. Tadashi publicly compares Uniqlo sales to the competition every year in his letter to shareholders. He annually updates Uniqlo's position and charts his rivals' own performances by name and currency. This is in stark contrast to Western companies who only address the existence of competition after poor results and will go to great lengths to avoid naming their closest rivals, even if everyone knows who they're talking about. Uniqlo is now in its present-day stage of sustaining, where the priority now is profit optimization. While they still maintain the fast fashion practices in frequent stocking and multiple deliveries to stores a week, the rotations are more colors and designs rather than products. They still occasionally develop new trending pieces like rain jackets or shoulder bags, but the R&D that they do now is nowhere near their historical pace. Uniqlo's current inventory turnover is lower than that of Gap, Nike, and Lululemon. The number of stores abroad has grown from 800 to 1,800 in 9 years. While there's been some consolidation in Uniqlo Japan since 2014, their overall domestic business has not slowed. The average store in Japan still grosses more in a single year than the average store abroad, which is wild to consider when we factor in the present-day weakness of the Japanese yen. But when we look beyond store productivity, the money is actually all coming from Uniqlo International, as overseas sales these days generate twice as much as domestic. With an established growth engine and a mature product mix, the company has had the luxury to shift their focus away from chasing trends to solving internal pain points. Uniqlo has pushed RFIDs and their own custom self-checkout machines as a way of permanently solving the labor shortages and addressing Japan's shrinking population. Profits have improved from the mid-2010s for both divisions, with International making the greatest strides. But the driver of these improvements is not really self-checkout, but rather lower product costs. Uniqlo's gross margins are currently at record highs, and in comparison, the margins were at their lowest in the late 90s and 2000s when the company was aggressively investing in materials and products to prove their quality to the market. While this could just be correlation and not causation, it seems more likely that Uniqlo is now downgrading their material and quality as a means to secure profits. In business, every decision has its ramifications. This urgency for profits are the results of the roosters coming home to roost for Tadashi. While he was successful at turning Uniqlo from a random suburban clothing store into a global fashion powerhouse, his arguably greatest and only blemish as a leader is in M&A. He had dreamed for decades of having a diversified, cross-category portfolio company like Gap, LVMH, or Kering, with multiple underlying billion-dollar brands, and Uniqlo just being one of them. Yet his acquisitions have never lived up to their billing. There was the American brand Theory, which Uniqlo purchased back in 2004 for $100 million, then $290 million in 2012 for J brand, 75 million euros in 2006 for a French label Comptoir, $150 million for a lingerie company called Princess Tam Tam in 2005, and then 240 million euros in 2009 for an American-Austrian luxury brand by the name of Helmut Lang. 2 decades later, these brands combined contribute just 15% of overall sales, despite consistently having more stores than Uniqlo Japan and Uniqlo International. Tadashi had spent nearly $1 billion pre-inflation buying these brands and unknown millions trying to grow them. But their weak performance dragged down overall margins, and if these 2 decades of investment and support haven't helped, it's hard to ask for more patience, which puts it all on Uniqlo to keep the profits and dividends flowing to shareholders. While Uniqlo was in survival mode during the 1990s and 2000s, H&M in that same period was scaling. The fast fashion supply chain that Tadashi had to build one piece at a time had already been perfected by the Swedish brand. At a time when Uniqlo was still purchasing clothes off of factory catalogs, H&M already had offices around Europe and Asia to be closer to their factories, they had employed buyers to build up a Rolodex of suppliers in every region, and they had already invested in their own laboratories to engineer cheaper synthetic materials. All of these measures for H&M had started in the 1970s and were done with the goal of being able to source the widest variety of clothes in the shortest amount of time at the lowest cost. Through the 90s to the 2000s, it was clear that these investments were paying off, as H&M features some of the highest gross profit of any label in the industry. They sold hundreds of millions of items every year with the widest catalog of outfits, classics, basics, sportswear, accessories, and cosmetics. Their leaders kept no secrets about how they saw the world. Fashion is perishable, and people want to be part of the latest trends. You either have it or you don't, and for the mass majority of consumers that are priced out, H&M would always be there with a budget solution. H&M opted to compete on information and speed over product, boasting every year just how in tune they were with customers. International sales at this point had been the core of H&M's business for decades. Sweden and the surrounding Nordic region represented at most just 20%, and that sales contribution only shrunk in subsequent years. The US, the UK, Germany, and France were H&M's strongest markets. But while Uniqlo was taking its time to prove its business overseas, H&M was putting pedal to the metal, and they opened up hundreds of net new stores in every region. They followed the industry standard playbook by leading with big flagships and then fast following with smaller locations in nearby malls. By the late 2000s, the average H&M store grossed nearly twice as much as the average Uniqlo. Customers were blown away by H&M's unprecedented value and variety, and sales and profits swelled to record highs. In the 2010s, H&M entered its third life stage of sustaining, but the company still mistakenly believed that it was scaling. H&M at this stage was led by Carl Johan Persson, who had been handed the keys to the kingdom by his father, who himself was handed the keys by his father, Erling. Carl Johan was the third generation in the family to run H&M. But because his grandfather had ensured H&M's survival in the 50s and his father had scaled H&M through the 90s into a global brand, Carl Johan, in comparison, had it easy. He had been born into a family of billionaires, and he objectively lacked the innate paranoia that plagues self-made businessmen like Uniqlo's Tadashi, who in comparison grew up in rural Japan as the son of a roadside tailor. When Carl Johan was appointed CEO of H&M in 2009, he had the luxury and capital to pursue any direction he wanted. Survival and scaling had already been handled by the prior generations. On the product side, he stuck to the same tactics. When athleisure took off, they launched H&M Sport. When collaborations became the thing, the company brought in Alexander Wang and David Beckham. On the side, he experimented moving H&M upmarket by hosting fashion shows in Paris, rolled out rewards programs, and supported online ordering when e-commerce took off. But when you're at the 10,000-foot level as a CEO, these are merely tactics, not strategy. Rather than setting a sales goal, Carl Johan set the number of stores as H&M's target. He publicly committed to opening 10 to 15% new stores every year for the next decade. By 2014, the company was opening a new store somewhere around the world every day of the year, a pace never seen before in the industry. As they prioritized scale, the company got even further away from product. Carl Johan was in his mid-30s, and without paranoia and experience, he could not see the market changing around him. He had been born in peacetime and could not recognize that H&M had a target on its back. When the media and millennials turned up the heat on fast fashion for its impact on workers and the environment, it was H&M and not Uniqlo that took the brunt of the criticism. Carl Johan responded directly to these challenges face-on by leading a multi-year charge on ethics and sustainability, committing fair wages for factory workers, auditing suppliers for better working conditions, lobbying governments for stronger labor standards, and reducing carbon emissions. The company's direction boiled down to just these two line items: sustainability and scale. What Carl Johan couldn't see was that the foundation of H&M's success was actually under threat. If we were to abstract clothing as a whole, it would look like a triangle. At the bottom of the triangle, you have everyday basics, which are the products with the highest profits and the greatest total addressable market. These are products that can be ordered in large volumes and have demand year-round. Then in the middle, you have current fashion, which is what customers are seeking in the current season, like puffers in the winter and dresses in the summer. These products in the middle can be sold for a lot more, but they also have to be moved before the season ends. And at the tip of the triangle, you have the trendiest, hottest garments, which are really only sought after by the fashion-forward big city dwellers, which represent the smallest addressable market and the smallest volumes. But the trade-off of smaller volumes means the highest prices, because you're offering what few people have. H&M had been successful over the decades, offering everything on this triangle at lower cost. Customers would stop in to look at a trendy piece, but end up with some seasonal garments and a few basics, or vice versa. But despite the flashy runway pieces and glamour shots, H&M's bread and butter as a business was ultimately still built on the basics and at the bottom of the triangle. There were two shifts in the mid-2010s. Uniqlo had specialized in basics and was now surging. They were winning over the customers at the bottom of the triangle. And at the tip of the triangle, you had Zara, who had specialized in the trendiest pieces, and they were far more aggressive about rotating inventory to win over the higher-income, fashion-forward big city dwellers. This left H&M with really just the middle of the triangle in current fashion, but even that was contested. Beyond what Zara and Uniqlo were doing, traditional labels like Gap, Abercrombie, and Ralph Lauren, who had gotten their lunch eaten for the past decade, were now incorporating fast fashion practices into their seasonal pieces. H&M was effectively being squeezed out. They had thrived in the past with first mover advantage, but now they lack the quality and the speed to compete anywhere in this triangle as a jack of all trades and a master of none. Revenue is a lagging indicator, not a leading one. By the time Carl Johan could see the gaps, the damage was already done. Overall sales grew as people were still buying H&M clothes, but not at full price. This was the quote-unquote relative satisfaction dynamic that Tadashi had been worried about a decade ago for Uniqlo, where customers only really develop loyalty to the lowest bidder. By the late 2010s, H&M's profits had plummeted to record lows. The decline was exacerbated by the fact that H&M had also lost its grip on its strongest markets. Sales in Europe were now regressing, and the new markets that they were banking on for growth were not really performing any better. The only region that was really growing was in the Americas, but the bottom line was wrecked from operating so many stores across two continents. It became impossible to tell if H&M sales were really growing or if they were just enjoying this initial honeymoon injection from these new stores. Inventory turnover dropped from 5 to 2. H&M found itself trapped in a never-ending cycle where they introduced new products every month, but they couldn't sell them at full price, and they were forced to later discount them just so their stores would have room for the next batch. When faced with these declining numbers, Carl Johan stubbornly stuck to scaling. He was convinced that this problem was not unique to H&M and that every fashion brand was suffering from the retail apocalypse and that personalized emails, mobile app experiences, and next-day delivery would turn things around. He was forced out in 2019, and by the time he stepped down, there were more H&M stores worldwide in 2019 than there are Uniqlo and Zara stores in 2024. H&M today is still stuck in sustaining. For the first time ever, they've handed the reins outside the family, but when you hire CEOs from the same management tree, all you really change are the faces. They appointed Carl Johan's lieutenant to run the company, but her only achievements before becoming CEO was leading H&M's superficial sustainability programs. Sales plateaued under her tenure, and she lasted just 4 years before resigning, citing that the job had become too stressful. What the company needs now is a true outsider who has no attachment to the past and has the ruthlessness to challenge what exists, as H&M today still operates more stores than Gap and Uniqlo. Zara is arguably the most secretive company ever covered on modern NBA. They publish only the bare minimum required by law. Their leaders and executives stay in the shadows and rarely appear publicly or give interviews. Their rationale and worldview has remained undisclosed for decades. Their financials tell us the how and the what, but leaves us to imagine why. And all we have are lagging indicators, not leading ones. H&M, Uniqlo, and just about every fashion brand sources product from third parties in Asia, where labor is the cheapest, and they willingly put up with the long lead times and the different time zones just to save a buck. Zara does the opposite, as they run their own factories and they work primarily with third parties that are located in close proximity to their Spanish headquarters. By manufacturing and contracting across Morocco, Portugal, Turkey, and Spain, Zara pays more for labor and product but gains the edge on speed. They turn ideas into finished products in as fast as 2 weeks and can deliver to stores by 3, whereas Uniqlo is reportedly still stuck at 4 to 6. Zara gains flexibility as all the inventory flows through Spain under one roof before being parceled out to every store worldwide. Production can start and stop on the fly, and there are no minimum order quantities, with everyone working in the same time zone. Proximity manufacturing is ultimately only useful if you're producing many different products at a time, and this is where Zara excels. They carry the trendiest pieces and they fill the demand for fashion-forward millennials who have the aspirations of high fashion but lack the budget for it. By convention, the bread and butter of a fashion brand should be in the easy-to-manufacture, trend-resistant, everyday basics. But Zara breaks from this convention in that they refresh their products monthly and they produce everything in small batches to minimize risk and to drive urgency. If customers see a product they like, they learn to buy it quickly, as there's a good chance it won't be around in a few weeks. Scarcity and exclusivity are the drivers, not reliability and availability. Zara has effectively carved out its own niche as a provider of high fashion without the high fashion price tag. Their parent company, Inditex, is the highest grossing mass market clothing brand in the world, with revenue that lags only behind the luxury conglomerates. While Uniqlo and H&M open hundreds of stores per year, Zara's expansion has been far slower. They strategically insert their stores in luxury areas with the goal of being as close as possible to Gucci, Prada, and LV. Any shopper that's priced out of high fashion will find what they're looking for at Zara. They have significantly fewer stores, but every Zara store grosses far more than that of H&M and Uniqlo. By selling the hottest pieces when interest is the highest but availability is at the lowest, Zara gets to charge a premium, all of which translates to consistent double-digit profits. While fashion labels generally spotlight their designers, Zara's designers, like the rest of their company, remain hidden. In some ways, the company's secretive nature is their cost of doing business. They'll do anything to sell clothes, even if that means breaking the law. Whether that's artists, boutique brands, or established luxury players, Zara has been the target of more infringement lawsuits and complaints than anyone else in the industry. While the plaintiffs have all tried to name and shame Inditex as a shameless dealer of high-end knockoffs, none of their litigation and PR has ever put a dent in Zara's momentum. The probability that Zara's customers will upgrade permanently to high fashion is near zero. If they do splurge, it would only be for a few items. At the end of the day, every wardrobe has to be balanced out with economical options, and there's no other mass market brand that's as entrenched in this gap between fast fashion and high fashion as Zara. While the legacy brands have reclaimed some of their market share from H&M, Uniqlo and Zara today are simply too strong to be toppled. If mass market fashion is to evolve, the reality is that change won't come from the supply side. It won't be some new business model that topples fast fashion, but rather a shift in consumer mindset. What's interesting to note is that it's not just Uniqlo who has struggled to create a portfolio company, but also H&M and Inditex. The market, for whatever reason, has only demonstrated the appetite for one dominant fast fashion brand at each level of the triangle. There's early emergent behavior that suggests that the market is indeed slowly changing. There's the revival of vintage stores as people pursue more lasting, one-of-a-kind items, the creative monotony where all the brands seem to peddle the same looks, and the growing fatigue of being dressed by the algorithm.